Hi, thanks for coming. I'm Tom Lydia, right from Montana Free Press. I'm your moderator today. You folks need one of these, right? Okay, I'll just walk it down to John. Thank you. We're going to speak up there.
I might need to, so.
Thank you.
Speak up there. Okay, yeah. Or would you rather sit? No, would you rather speak? Yeah. Okay. So, thank you. This is our discussion about the changing politics in the rural West. Our first speaker today is author Jon Bennion. Jon is, the author of Big Sky Politics. Closer? Okay. So, our first speaker is Jon Bennion. Jon is the author of Big Sky Politics, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about sort of how that landscape has changed over the last several decades. Jon's book has just been revised, right? Is it out yet or out soon? Soon. So, Jon, would you like to speak?
Thank you, Tom. It's good to be here today. It's good to talk about something that I like to nerd out on, which is Montana politics. So, as Tom mentioned, I do have a book called Big Sky Politics. Let's see if this thing works. It was first published in 2004, and so it covered more post-war politics in Montana from 1946 to 2002, so wildly out of date at this point. But coincidentally, it's getting republished in partnership with the Montana Free Press, and it will be out in a month and a half. And towards the end of my remarks, I'll let you know how you can get a notification of when it becomes available. So, like I said, in 2000, that's kind of when I really started being active in politics. I was a student at the University of Montana, studying political science. Eventually, I went on to work in D.C. for a little bit, came back, and went to law school. And during this time, I was nerding out, looking up a lot of Montana history. This was still when the internet was in its infancy, and so there weren't a lot of resources when it came to Montana politics, whether it was on the internet or whether it was published sources. And I didn't set out to write a book. I just set out to really just understand, number one, who won big elections, maybe why did they win, what were their biographies, what did they campaign on, and that was really the essence of Big Sky Politics, the first edition, that looked at post-war politics up through 2002. This was right around the time, if you remember, has anyone repressed the memories of the 2000 presidential election cycle? That was quite an election, right, for any of our lifetimes. It was strange. I think it was kind of the start of our obsession with politics, more of the 24-hour cycle of politics and the nationalization of politics. I think it can really start then. Also, what started around that time was the red state, blue state. Okay, we didn't always used to say that, In fact, I remember seeing something from like the 1992 elections, and the colors were switched. The Democrats were red and the Republicans were blue, and I'm like, well, they got it all wrong. What are they doing? And it's like, that wasn't a thing. We didn't say like red state, blue state until after around the 2000 or right after that. And so it was at that time when people obsessed with politics and political pundits that like to put states in boxes. And so at that time, Montana became a red state. And why would we be a red state? Well, because for the most part, in modern political history in Montana, we have preferred Republican presidential candidates. That kind of oversimplified Montana politics. And even at that time, as a young student, I understood that was probably an oversimplification of Montana. When you look at descriptions of Montana politics around that time or before then, a lot of times people were describing us as independent. There was even one author that described us as politically schizophrenic. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about and some of this. So let's go back actually to statehood, first of all. Montana had a real tough time becoming a state in the first place before 1889, and that's because Montana had a preference for Democratic politicians at that time. And so with the U.S. Senate, oftentimes controlled by Republicans, there was this problem about getting states that were perceived as Democrat into the Union. And so Montana's DNA, in some respects, was fairly Democratic. And then the New Deal only reinforced that. So FDR coming in, he won Montana all 4 elections. During that time, Democrats dominated in many respects in the state legislature, most of the state offices. So let's go actually right after the New Deal. We had Harry Truman. This was the 1948 election when Democrats were not supposed to do well at all. If you could divide Montana, if you're from Montana, you know that oftentimes the most common dividing line in Montana is either the Continental Divide or just east-west, right? You don't hear about many other kinds of dividing lines in Montana. So that's actually a picture of Montana's congressional districts in the 1948 election. So the gray coloring is Democratic counties, the white are Republican counties. So what you're seeing here is a dynamic that lasted for nearly the whole time we had 2 congressional districts up until we lost it in 1992. So from 1913 to 1992, nearly all of the Western District elections were won by Democrats. There are some exceptions, and I'll show you that. On the eastern side, nearly all of the elections were won by Republicans, also some exceptions to that. So this kind of color-coded line shows you on the top is the Western District, the bottom one is the Eastern District, and then, of course, there was a couple of decades there where we had just an at-large district. And then now to the current era, starting in 2022, we once again have 2 districts. And again, that line hasn't been exactly the same with reapportionment. It has changed a few counties over this way, a few counties over that way. But that's kind of a traditional dividing line in Montana. Now, for that 1948 election, these are the ones I wanted to show you because it shows some interesting things about Montana politically that a lot of people don't understand around this time in 1948. What is anyone seeing here? North-south. Did anybody really think of Montana in north-south terms? So when you look at especially the Senate election there, if you understand Montana, you know that top part, especially in the top eastern part, the Montana High Line, and then going over more towards Great Falls and the Continental Divide there, you've got the Golden Triangle, quite Democratic. And that was a hallmark of FDR's win, a lot of Democrats win. And of course, you know, the West, for the most part, pretty Democratic as well. But Democrats winning in many places that we don't see today. And so we're going to fast forward a little bit more to the current era. But first, I want to show you, here's the U.S. Senate makeup. And now you're starting to understand a little bit more of the Democratic roots. So Montana, just like other states, started popularly electing their senators after the 17th Amendment in 1912. And for the most part, up until Conrad Burns in 1988, we'd only elected one Republican for one single term. Very strong preference for liberal Democrats when it came to the U.S. Senate. For governor, up along the top, it's a little bit more back and forth. We go in 16 to 20-year cycles of electing Democrats, then swinging back and electing Republicans for another 16 to 20 years. And then the coloring here shows the makeup of the state legislature. So you can see going back and forth, oftentimes control switching from Republicans to Democrats. Democrats in the state Senate having a very strong dominant period there in the 60s and 70s, with Republicans having much more success in the 90s and beyond. So now you can start to understand a little bit more of what that author was saying as politically schizophrenic, or certainly probably more accurately independent. So, like I said, the origins of the blue state, red state, I think that really dates back to 2000. Again, Montana, around 2000, we overwhelmingly voted for George W. Bush. Does anyone know the last Democrat to get a majority of the presidential vote in Montana? Bueller? LBJ. Who said that? All right, you get a star. LBJ, 1964 landslide. Bill Clinton won a plurality in 1992, but again, so Montana has a strong preference for Republicans. But what happened after 2000, in 2004, 2006, 2008, there was a bit of a mini Democratic golden era in Montana that lasted. So I'm going to show you two elections from that. 2004, the governor's election. 2006, the Senate election. Compare those with what you saw from 1948. More sparse, not as many counties, but there is still some semblance, like I said, along the High Line, Great Falls there, a real key aspect of any Democrat's chances of success statewide. So from 2004 up until 2012, kind of a very strong golden era for Montana Democrats in Montana. And so the whole idea of us being a red state during that time, which people would still call us that, was kind of silly, right? It's just like our internal politics was at best competitive, or, at least competitive, but you could also argue in some ways dominated by Montana Democrats during that time period. So let's fast forward more to 2024, the last presidential election. And we had a single Democratic statewide official, no regional state or regional Democrats at that time. It was just a single senator. And what's really remarkable about this is just how few counties really are left. You've got, of course, where we're at, Bozeman, right next to us, Livingston. You've got Lewis and Clark, which is Helena, Missoula, and then Butte and Anaconda. And then the rest, besides Havre, are largely tied to Indian country, places where native Montanans have the majority vote in those areas. And you can start to see why this shrinking landscape makes it a lot more impossible for Democrats to win at a statewide level. It's even more bleak when you look at the 2024 presidential election, and it just comes down to really 5 counties. And I'll just remark that those 2 small ones in the lower left, Butte, Silverbow, and Deer Lodge, Anaconda. Deer Lodge, Anaconda almost voted for Trump in 2024. And so a lot of these counties are really potentially at a tipping point to where they may be shifting long-term in one particular direction. And so while Montana has had a history of, in many ways, strong Democratic DNA in its roots, and in recent political memory, some very competitive elections. We know that since 2014, it's been a whittling away where we've had the strongest one-party dominance probably in our state's history since the 1930s and the 1920s. But I'll just remark that Montana's not alone in that, right? When you look at the U.S. Senate and what you call split delegations, there's technically 4, but that's counting Bernie in Vermont and Angus King in Maine, who caucus with Democrats. So it's really only down to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania that have split U.S. Senate delegations. When you look at the states that are controlled by one party and their legislature and the governor, we're down to just a handful. And so the fact that Montana is moving in this direction as a result of the nationalization of politics, people moving into the state potentially that are more conservative, and then the realignment that's happened at the national level, those are all factors that have contributed to these trends in Montana state political history. With that, hopefully I didn't overwhelm you with information, but looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, John. So next we're going to hear from Zach Brown, who's a Gallatin County Commissioner. Zach was also a former state legislator, and he'll be talking about the changing rural landscape in the West. I think he's going to tell us a little bit about Win It. Is that right? Okay, Zach, you want to take over?
Thank you, Tom. To begin, I want to acknowledge an obvious elephant. I am not an expert on rural affairs or rural politics. By Montana standards, I'm an urbanite, unequivocally so. Even my siblings, who are relative Gallatin County urbanites themselves, laugh at me for my tiny house in the middle of Bozeman, which I have chosen in no small part so that I can walk and bike to work. I own a Vespa, for crying out loud. My nieces and nephews tease me all the time for being a weirdo who rides his bike everywhere and doesn't drive enough. I have lived in Bozeman and Missoula for all but 1 year of my life, and in that 1 year of exception, I lived on the East Coast. All that being said, my career in public service in Montana, I think, brings some useful perspectives to bear in this conversation, so I'll do my best to bring those forward in today's discussion. I am in my 12th year of serving in elected office in Montana. My first 6 years were in the Montana House of Representatives, which mixed me into a dysfunctional melting pot of Montanans from all corners of the state. And because Montana has a citizen legislature model, I had to make a living by having another full-time job. In my case, I worked for a nonprofit organization that was aiming to, quote, bridge the rural-urban divide. This mission, while difficult to attain, exposed me to numerous community building efforts in the most rural corners of Montana, and it allowed me to problem solve with community leaders in these far-flung places. That work also gave me a connection with many of my rural colleagues in the legislature, and I'm so proud of the community I built in those years of my career. Now today, I serve as a Gallatin County Commissioner, so in some respects, I have taken a backwards political journey beginning at the state level and then zooming back in and backtracking to local government and local community leadership. And I'll date myself briefly in the context of John's presentation. In 2000, during the Bush v. Gore election, I was in Mrs. Woodhull's 4th grade class at Hawthorne Elementary School. So I've lived my entire adult and adolescent life post this national polarization that John described. And certainly I've served all my 12 years in elected office in our hyper-polarized modern political context. To begin, let me state something obvious. I am a Democrat. I came by this label with pain in my heart because when I first ran for office at 23 years old, I was invited to run by the local Democratic Party, and actually my first phone call was from Kathleen Williams, and I'll never forget it. I saw Kathleen in the back. One of my professional and political heroes. I had not yet admitted to myself, let alone anyone else, that I was willing to identify with such a label, but I did eventually, for better or worse, and now 12 years later, here I am. Now for another obvious observation, especially after Jon broke it down with data. Democrats are not doing well in rural Montana, or rural America for that matter. And for most of my 20s, I fought this trend with everything I had available to me. I thrashed about in Democratic caucus meetings, party platform conventions, on the House floor, on the internet, in community meetings, and wherever else I could find to thrash about to make this shifting reality seem less true. Just yesterday, while cleaning my office, I found a relic of my legislative service that perfectly emblemized this thrashing. It was a thank you card from members of a Central Montana agricultural community organization, which I'll talk about in a moment, thanking me for my vote on a resolution that criticized the tactics of the American Prairie Reserve and their BLM grazing lease changes for bison. It's worth pausing here to give a little context. I was and I am a Bozeman Democrat, and the American Prairie Reserve is based in Bozeman and was founded by my childhood friend's father. I was one of only 2 Democrats in the legislature to vote against that resolution, and I was lambasted for doing so, perhaps fairly, because of the obvious contradiction to my personal community politics. I also probably offended and disappointed more than a few of my neighbors in Bozeman's conservation community. But I digress. The point is that I tried very hard to make this reality that Democrats are not resonating or winning in rural communities less true. Some of my tactics were successful or authentic, and some were not. But despite my efforts and feelings to the contrary, this truth is deepening around us all the time. So what now, you might ask? Well, in my eyes, this journey is worth sharing because it highlights a basic truth about myself as an individual, but also, I think, a truth that most of us can relate to. Ultimately, we want to be known as our unique selves as human beings, and we deeply desire to relate to one another on a human level, a human connection and relational one that transcends labels and groupishness and assumptions that really dictate partisan politics. Party politics implies the ultimate label on an individual or an idea, and it unfortunately reduces and simplifies many of our nuanced humanness and individualities. And in today's ultra-polarized online world, the power of these labels has never been more reducing and more potent. So a personal invitation, first to myself and then to all of you, is to rebel against these labels and their impulses. Lean towards difference instead of away from it. Show up in communities with your humanness and relationality first, and leave your assumptions, labels, fears, and otherness behind. The folks who have taught me this lesson, perhaps more than anyone else in my life, are the King family in Petroleum County, who you see on this screen. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about them and the miraculous community of Winnett, Montana. This place, I will argue to the grave, has more to show America about the path forward for rural communities than any other place. As of the 2020 census, and Daniel teed this up perfectly, the population of Petroleum County was 496 people, making it the least populous county in Montana and the 8th least populous county in the United States. Its county seat is Winnett, which has a population of 188. The county's area was partitioned from Fergus County in 1925 to become the last of Montana's 56 counties. And I can tell you firsthand as a 2020 rural Montana census organizer that Winnett gained population during the last census, if only by a dozen or so people, despite the downward trends facing most rural communities. And I think what I'm about to tell you is a major reason why. First, the King family. Chris and Gary King and their adult children, Jay and Kylie, make their living on the family ranch south of Winnett, raising Black Angus cattle and goats. I met Chris and Gary first in 2013 when a mutual friend from Helena took us all on a strange and thrilling trip to Cuba. Chris was at the time a Republican Petroleum County Commissioner, and I was a 23-year-old who knew how to get himself invited on exciting trips. Through my eventual friendship with this family, I have over the years come to meet many, if not most, of the 496 residents of Petroleum County at some wedding or bar stool or other community gathering. The first thing you will notice about these folks, with Chris being the prime example, is that they lean towards difference rather than away from it. Every time I see Chris, he has a list of political topics he wants to discuss with me. We started with immigration policy all those years ago, a policy topic that I can spend many lifetimes discussing and which we all know to be incredibly polarizing. But these discussions over the years have veered into wildlife management, taxation policy, drugs and criminality, funding for law enforcement and mental health, fiscal policy, and really so many other sprawling political and social hot-button issues. The central point here is that Chris craves these discussions, and I found that he would often have a list of topics waiting for me on my visits to Winnett that he had been formulating in his truck or tractor over the days and weeks preceding my visit. He knew that this goofy guy from Bozeman, who was elected as a Democrat, has very different political views and experiences than most of his neighbors, and instead of fearing or judging that difference, he actually craved it. Now I think about that for a moment. It's so simple, and it's also so radical and profound. Now, to be clear, Chris and I never talked or debated to win anything from one another, but no doubt these debates and discussions have created mutual admiration and respect that transcend our differences. Okay, so now you're saying to yourself, that's nice for you, Zach. You have a rural friend. But what the hell does that have to do with me or this conference? Hold on one moment, and I'll tell you a bit more about Winnett. During these years of friendship, which, by the way, this has become one of the most beautiful parts of my life, I've been to Africa and Africa and Europe with Chris's son, Jay. I attended his wedding last summer, the picture on the right, with two of the most amazing Laura Nolan and Brenda Brady sisters who run that town in many ways. I visit often to help with cattle vaccinations or bar stool debates in the Winnett Bar. It goes on and on. But during these years of friendship, the King family did a radical thing with their neighbors. They created a community organization dedicated to reviving their community and making Petroleum County livable for the next generation. Let's see. They're actively investing in projects, land, and infrastructure that intends to bring their kids back home to the ranch and bucks the trend of rural population loss. This organization is called Winnett ACES. Agricultural Community Enhancement and Sustainability is what ACES stands for. And I, this guy right here, am a member of Winnett ACES. And for $25 a year, you can be too. Think about that. They invite outsiders like me to be members of their community group. They celebrate it. And I, by the token of their invitation, have deemed myself to be the president of the Bozeman Area Winnett Fan Club. It might sound a little trite, but it's so deeply profound, folks. If you have ever lived in a tiny town, you know that they're often a little closed off to outsiders and the unknown as a generality, but not Winnett. Going back to the King family for a moment, Chris and Gary played a foundational role in getting this organization off the ground. And in my eyes, they helped set the tone with a handful of other community-minded families to set the tone of growth, inclusion, and abundance towards outside groups and individuals that might have something to offer their community. Well, this abundance and growth mindset has become contagious because they have now raised millions of dollars, built a community center that is the envy of any town or city in Montana. They've purchased property. They literally grouped their money together as a community and bought a ranch that now serves as a grass bank for young people who want to come back and start their business and start their herd. It's radical stuff. ACES employs nearly a dozen young people. They're leading other community revitalization projects, such as the rehabilitation of a historic downtown building or their county courthouse. And they actively collaborate with conservation groups, national politicians, other ag and community organizations, and the list goes on. So when Chris was leaning towards me and my differences all those years ago, I came to learn that he was also leaning towards others in a similar way. The American Prairie Reserve, as I talked about earlier, was kind of feeling like an existential threat to many folks in central Montana in the ag community. And they, instead of retreating into a fearful, angry position, they started reaching out to other conservation groups like WWF and the Nature Conservancy and said, what can we do together to improve our community? And by doing so, they helped create a community contagion that will never be fully understood or contained. And now, today, Petroleum County, Montana is a beacon of hope and promise, rather than a site of rural decline and despair. Their whole community has taught themselves how to be solution-oriented, curious, and positive in the face of economic and demographic trends that have most rural places feeling fearful and retreating. To conclude, I want to remind you that each of us is more unique and complex than any labels that others may ascribe. We're more unique and individual as Montanans than a red state, as Mr. Bennion pointed out. Treat yourself that way with the curiosity and reverence that you deserve, and treat others that way too. Be like Chris King and lean towards difference rather than away from it. It's contagious that way, to think that way, and it's truly addictive. This way of thinking has put Winnet on a completely inspiring and unlikely trajectory of growth and civic connectedness. And it just might be the example and the medicine that we all need in our own lives and efforts to improve rural Montana and the other struggling communities across the West. The future of our families, our communities and our governance systems, and the future of the civic threads that hold this nation together perhaps depend on such courageous and intentional curiosity. So, how do we make rural politics more hopeful and abundant? By showing up and leaning into differences, by being hopeful and curious about differences rather than repulsed by them, and by honoring and perpetuating real community leadership. Because in small towns, it doesn't matter whether your politics are red or blue or yellow or purple. When it's your turn to step up for a school board seat or a conservation district supervisor position or for county commission, then by God, it's your turn and you step up. And when these local rural leaders model optimism and curiosity, it's contagious and so darn hopeful. What can this mean for smaller, nationalized, fearful rural politics? What does it mean for Montana or the National Democratic Party? I don't know about those questions, and frankly, I'm not concerned about them at this point in my life. What I'm worried about is how to be more human, more connected, more curious, and more engaged with difference, and ultimately more present. These personal concerns are more human and more tangible and interesting and productive from my point of view. And my hunch is that this curiosity and relational focus would be more productive for all of us across the rural West as an alternative to worrying about making the others around us think, act, or vote in a more familiar way. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Our next speaker is Riley Summers Flanagan. I have to say, as the West changes politically, there's been a really sharp increase in lawsuits in Montana concerning the state constitution as well as the U.S. Constitution. And we have, on the ballot in 2030, we have a vote on, whether to reconvene and consider changing the state's constitution. Riley is the attorney more than anybody in Montana when I'm writing about challenges to the Constitution that I call. She seems to gravitate to these things. Riley, you want to stand up? Thanks.
I'm gonna stay away from the podium, if that's okay. And hopefully we're gonna. So. Tom is right. I sue the state a lot. I really enjoy doing that with my time. I also spend a lot of time walking around the state, driving around the state, and talking to communities of all sizes about the Montana Constitution. And we're going to talk a little bit later about why that is. But I also just want to say that, what a really extraordinary panel of people to be on, recognizing fully that Zach is right. We are not representative of rural Montana. I grew up in Missoula. My family is from Absaroka, which is very rural, and my mom grew up there, and my cousins grew up there, but I did not. So not able to speak from a direct experience of growing up in rural Montana, but very committed to our state. So we're going to talk for a second. I think that it's really helpful. I've taken a few of the slides from my roadshow presentation to give us a little bit of context for what we're talking about. Now, I decided to start with this slide because it is one that sort of gets us into what is the point of having maybe politics at all. And so we can probably, everyone in this room can think of something that has changed in the last 20 years, in the last 10 years, in art, culture, medicine, science, technology, politics, law, perhaps? A few people can think of something. Anyone want to give me an example of something that's changed? Social media. Who said social media? Awesome, thank you. Social media is such a good example, and it really works well for this little layer cake we've got up here. So when we are thinking about the ways in which we as individual people are responding to changes in the society around us, one of the things that we know is that we can change our own behavior, right, in response to those changes pretty quickly. I suspect that there are some people in this room who have an Instagram account. Will you raise your hand if you have an Instagram account? And, okay, anybody not have an Instagram account? Many people. Amazing. Anybody have no social media account at all? Yay. Nice. Terry, love it. Love to see it. Yes. If you didn't hear, you can follow on Instagram at West Center. Yes, so if you have an Instagram account, get logged on right now. In any case, here's the thing. One of what this illustrates to us is that we get to make different choices, right, about the way that we want to engage in changing technology in the world. And one of the reasons why this is really important to understand is that we also know that if we in this room needed to come up with a rule for how we together were going to engage with social media, we would have a significantly harder time agreeing on a specific rule, right? It would take us longer, for sure, than each of us individually in our lives. This is obvious. It is one of the reasons why we've come up with a system for group decision-making. Elections serve as a mechanism for each of us to express the ways in which we want to be represented in our politics. We look for the candidates who best represent the way that we believe we should respond to social change. The people who, perhaps folks are familiar with some of the controversies around TikTok in the last few years. And we know that there were moments when people were really focused on what our politicians' perspectives on TikTok, and arguably this is still relevant, but there was a moment, right, when it was a really big deal and we were very concerned with what our politicians were saying about TikTok. So we make these decisions about who we want to represent us. We ask ourselves who is going to respond to changes in society most directly, most in relation with our own beliefs. And we put people in office who become policymakers. Now, one thing, of course, to remember is elections happen every 2, 4, 6 years. They're inherently delayed. After there is change in society, we as individuals, we can respond quickly. We can immediately delete our TikTok accounts if we want to, right? But we can't change the way in which our society is responding to that change except through the election system. So we do this, we put someone into office, that person becomes a policymaker, a lawmaker, they implement these changes in time, and it takes time. Governor Gianforte has been the governor of Montana for the last 6 years. He's been implementing policy the whole time, right? He's not somebody who got into office and in the first month he accomplished everything that he wanted to do and has put his feet up ever since. That's just true across the board. And as having one current and one former legislator right here on this panel, we know that our lawmakers spend an extraordinary amount of time thinking about perspectives and condensing those and bringing them all together. Okay, so as you may be able to tell, the document that I'm going to point out, the Constitution, moves the slowest of all in response to change. That's by design. You have to come to the roadshow to hear more context for this. We're doing it everywhere, so just check it out. But I want you to sort of think about that as we progress and as we think about the Montana Constitution specifically, which is what I want to focus on. Okay. Now, I have an exercise that we do with this particular slide, and maybe we'll just do it. Will somebody raise their hand who's willing to let me use their name? If no one does, then someone I know is going to get picked. Isaac. King Isaac. We're going to make Isaac the king. Honestly, not a bad choice, really. We all appreciate Isaac. Isaac is going to be king of everything. What does this mean for the rest of us? We concentrate all political power in him. What does it mean? What's that? We have to ask him for everything. What else? We have to do what he says. And what happens if we break Isaac's rules? Somebody said it. Did somebody say off with those heads? Yeah. That's my favorite thing. Okay, perfect. So, yes, That's exactly right. Thank you. We have to listen to what he says. We could be in big trouble if we don't obey him. He makes the laws. He decides what those laws mean. He tells us what they mean, and he enforces them. He decides when they're enforced, how they're enforced, who they're enforced against, and he gets to make these decisions quickly at the drop of a hat. Okay. Now, I'm gonna make just the slightest gesture at Jon's presentation and talk for just a moment about Montana history. Now, how do we end up with the state that we have? Well, in 1889, we wrote the Constitution that ultimately governed us until 1972. And as Jon mentioned, of course, we wrote one in 1884 as well, but we weren't able to enter the Union because the Senate wanted that sort of those balanced states, that there was going to be a balance between the political views as they entered the Union. Now, in 1889, that balance was achieved. I believe we had 6 states enter the Union. And the person who oversaw the writing of the 1889 Constitution is this man, William Clark, you see up here with all the facial hair. William Clark, Marcus Daly, and Gus Heinze are all folks who were Copper Kings in this era. They did not like each other. They were competitors. They were truly not friends. And there's a whole series of stories, but anybody know the really fun fact about William Clark? What did he do in 1900? Anybody know? Yes, somebody knows. He bought a Senate seat. He bought a Senate seat. He bought a Senate seat because at the time the state legislature could pick the person that was going to represent the state. And so he actually went around the state with his son, paying people off. They were paying off people's debts. They were buying land for people. They were paying for people's education. Now, this was very effective, and when your legislature is the one who is picking your senator, it makes bribery significantly more efficient, right? It's much faster to pay 150 people than the roughly 50,000 people who were living in Montana at the time. And this is the character, right? This is the flavor. William Clark was also known for one of his famous quotes is, "Never met a man I couldn't buy." The man was proud of his skill at bribing people. This ultimately results in the passage of the 17th Amendment. He's not the sole contributor of the model of quid pro quo politics, but he is one of them. And so we inspire the passage of the 17th Amendment, which allows all of us to directly elect our senators. Kind of a neat little contribution we got to make. Now, I want to just point out, sorry, I'm going to go back. We see in the coils of the anaconda in this political cartoon, and we see the snake. Okay, now, I have officially too much material because it turns out that I've been spending too much time talking about all these things, and so I'm going to just run through a little bit more and tell you all that you should come to the roadshow because it's really fun. We need to write a constitution in 1972 largely because the 1889 Constitution does not protect political participation. It protects smoke-filled back rooms. Secretary of State Bob Brown tells a story about how and I'm a little sad because I messed up my slides a tiny bit and you can't see the 30-some delegates on this slide. There were 100 that were elected in 1972. But so Secretary of State Bob Brown tells this story about how in the 1960s, he was serving in the state legislature in his first elected office. And he discovered that there was actually a man who sat at the Placer Hotel, and you had to go and check and see if that man would sign off on the legislation that you were bringing. And that man was a representative of the Anaconda Mining Company. And this was a thing that was happening regularly. So the 1960s roll around, there's sort of a political moment, right? We have this moment where people are starting to think about their state constitutions. They're starting to consider, what is it that we want to do with these, right? They're an obligation. You have to have one to join the union, but they're also an opportunity. And so we really take that very seriously. Now, there's a whole series of things that we can talk about here, but one of the most beautiful things that happens during the Montana Constitutional Convention in 1972 is that we sit alphabetically. And this has a major impact on the outcome of the way in which the Constitutional Convention turns out. At the end of the 54 days that they spend writing it, all 100 delegates sign that Constitution recommending it to the people of Montana. And I've got a few highlights for you. We had 19 women, 9 of whom were members of the League of Women Voters. We had no Native American delegates. Until 1975, most Native people in the state of Montana were not allowed to participate in our elections because as indirect taxpayers to the state of Montana, they were categorically excluded from the eligibility criteria. And that doesn't mean that people didn't participate. We did have folks who participated. Mavis Scott stood up on behalf of herself and her colleague, Lynn Loop. They were college students at the time. They talked about the importance of Indian education, of being of celebrating Indigenous cultures in our state. And so this is something that ends up in the Montana Constitution. We also see a lot of other folks who are big players in this moment, and they're coming from all over the state. We've got Gene Harbaugh up here. He's from Poplar, Montana, out near the Fort Peck Reservation, and he hears a whole lot. He really amplifies the testimony of Mavis Scott, advocates for the Indian Education for All provision that appears in our education part of our Constitution. We also have Delegate Louise Cross, grew up in Red Lodge, Montana, chaired the Environmental Committee, and Louise Cross had experienced the water that you can eat and the air that you can taste in Red Lodge at the time, and so she was really committed. At the time, she was also in Glendive, Montana, representing Dawson County, extremely rural Montana, right? And so I want to just sort of draw out that there are these folks who come from all over the state. They speak about their experiences directly, and they have all different kinds of backgrounds. We have everything from retired FBI agent to housewife to college professor, and they come together and they come up with a document that has lasted us 50 years and counting. Now, that document was a very close vote when it passed. Lots more to say about that, but I think the bottom line is that it's interestingly something that has remained extremely popular over time. The Montana Constitution is something that a lot of Montanans can get on the same page about. I think that it speaks to some of what Zach was talking about when we're thinking about sort of what is the human experience and how do we relate to each other on a human level. And on that note, I'm gonna wrap it up, but I really am excited to hand things off to Tom and to Cora and excited to chat more with everybody. I'll put it back.
Whichever. So thank you, Riley. Our last speaker today is Cora Newman. Cora is in the state Senate. She's an agent of change, I guess. It's probably the nicest way to put that. Cora, do you want to talk to us about change? Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I'm excited for you to moderate. Tom is a journalist and always asks really good, hard questions. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A portion of this as well. My name is Cora Newman. I'm in the state Senate. I represent Bozeman, southern Bozeman, all the way down through Big Sky and West Yellowstone. And this has been so fun to listen to not only the history, so I feel like I'm building on this foundation of the history of Montana politics, which is very inspiring. Our Constitution, which I think we all, if you know it, to know it is to love it, so definitely go to the roadshow. And then Zach, I need to join formally, but I'm definitely a member of the Win It Aces fan club. I love that story. I think it's a really Montana story, so really happy to be here. Isaac, thank you for your work here. Hopefully someday you'll be governor. Everyone take note, Isaac Narig. And thank you to Stanford and MSU for having me. I don't know if I have, oh, there it is. Okay, so I'm gonna share a story that's really grounded in the here and now. We've heard the history and the context of why we are where we are. And I'm just gonna share the story of working together in the Montana State Senate, which I also think is a very Montana story. We are independent. I like to think that we are, even with this swinging back and forth and this now being labeled a deep red state, I'm not believing it yet. I think that we are really independently minded, and we do like to sit with each other and talk to each other and have the kind of conversations that Zach and Chris have, where we dig into things and can have hard conversations. A little bit more about just background on me. I actually have my grandmother's great uncles came to Montana in the 1860s. They were displaced. They were Jewish German immigrants. At the time in Germany, there were only allowed to be a certain number of Jewish adult males in each village. So they were displaced from their communities in Germany. They came here. They displaced people here, for sure, Native American populations. And now we're facing a new kind of swing and trend of displacement in Montana, especially in this county. And so I think that these are things, the history of how we all got here and where we are, this is on us to figure out together. How do we shift from displacing to working together and collaborating and finding ways forward where we can all feel at home here. Those are my college-aged kids and my husband, and this is my first term, so I'm a new state senator. It's my first session in office. So one thing that this is not unique to Montana, but one of the challenges we face is that Montana politics, just like so many state politics around the country, have been nationalized. I think it's good that we're having conversations about things like immigration and some of the other nationalized issues, but those should not precede the conversations that we're having with each other about what's happening in our towns at this very moment. And so I think that one of the reasons we've become more and more polarized, and this can be something we discuss potentially, is just the nationalization of our local politics and whether or not that's helping us. We were once a purple state, now we're considered deep red, and I served in this, it's not a supermajority anymore, and hopefully we'll have Kathleen with us next session, so she can join this effort. But it's not a supermajority, but it is majority Republican. And one of the things that we experienced and had to navigate was really the emergence of and the power of the Freedom Caucus, which is really generally a fully nationalized contingent. The Freedom Caucus is supported and funded by national players and funding, and they are bringing that national agenda to Montana, which I think is part of the reason it's been so difficult to navigate. So if you followed our session this year, we basically developed a working majority of Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. And we also had a coalition in the House. And so the reason that this emerged was because on day one, the more extremist contingent of the Republican Party tried to kick the moderates out and basically put them in a holding pattern in committees that really had no power. And so from that moment forward, I feel like what I'd like to think was our Montana instinct kicked in, and we decided we were not going to stand for that type of control over our ability to think independently, to vote independently, and to represent our constituents, not what either of our parties were telling us to do. And so in the Senate, we had 9 Republicans and 18 Democrats, and we did not agree on everything. By a long shot. We had things we agreed on, and then we had things we absolutely did not agree on. But what we did agree on was to come together and vote for our constituents and for Montana first. And so this working majority was 27 of us. Tom definitely followed and documented it very well. And so we did get some national coverage on this. And one of the reasons I share this is because I felt personally like I felt very proud, right, that we were able to come together and work together, and I wanted to help this story be seen nationally at a time when things are so divisive and so toxic. People are in a lot of pain, there's a lot of fear, and we are seeing a rise in hate as well across this country. And so sharing this story nationally and trying to inspire and help people see that we do still know how to work together. We can still disagree on many things, but agree on others. And I think so we had a piece in the New York Times and CBS Morning News, just because it is, and hopefully continues to inspire more collaboration across the country. Some of the things that we did deliver, so Medicaid expansion, and I could go in depth on this, but maybe not yet, but Medicaid expansion in Montana, there was a sunset on our ability to offer Medicaid to those who had no coverage and who were below a certain level of poverty line. The biggest goal of the Freedom Caucus was to end Medicaid expansion. That was their number one goal, and they had been recruiting candidates, and they still are, to try to end this. Now, what happens if you lose Medicaid expansion in Montana is you lose rural hospitals, critical access hospitals. Montana has proudly not lost any. And we continue to be able to offer healthcare all across the state. Not that it's without challenges, but we do have that expansion. So we reauthorized that right away. And one of the interesting things that happened was the extreme side of the Republican Party, the Freedom Caucus, they assumed that if we could just vote on Medicaid and get that out of the way, that our coalition would break up. They didn't realize that we had built something deeper in terms of connecting and agreeing on a set of things that we wanted to carry through all the way to the end of the session. So we actually passed Medicaid expansion in February, which is a huge win, and then continued to go on to increase teacher pay, make some historic investments in childcare, although we still need more, pass a property tax relief bill, which is very complicated, but definitely has offered a lot of relief to almost 400,000 Montanans. And then we set aside some funding, a trust fund for housing and infrastructure to help Montana weather the storm, some of the storms that we're seeing right now. So these were just a select number of things that without this bipartisan coalition would not have happened. These are my bills. Happy to share more. I just wanted to share this update on my focus. My background is in public health and in healthcare and rural healthcare. I work with indigenous communities, rural communities, have worked with refugee communities. And so my overarching goal in the legislature is to take care of the people who take care of us. So mothers, teachers, caregivers, first responders, farmers and ranchers. So I sit on the Senate, the Senate Ag Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the Health and Human Services Committee. And through all of those, this was my first set of bills that I was able to pass. One that was extremely difficult to pass, but got great support, was PTSD coverage under workers' comp for first responders. It got great support, passed the Senate 29-20, the House 60-40. It was then vetoed. So it wasn't all, rainbow and sunshine. I did have veto on some of these bills, even after we built great consensus. But we're going back to the drawing board. I've already started meetings with first responders and communities across the state because I'm determined to help, again, make sure, especially at a time when we're experiencing across the state the mental health crisis and other healthcare crises that we're seeing continue to play out. We need to make sure that our first responders have the care that they need so that they can take care of us. We also had to protect. I don't know if anyone follows. We did have an amendment to the Constitution that protects the right to privacy, which includes abortion. Despite this, because of, again, nationalized agenda items, we had to fight back multiple attacks on the right to privacy and the right to abortion. We were able to successfully block those. But this is one of those moments where I had to ask from the Senate floor, who are you representing? Why is this bill in front of us? 60% of Montanans have made their voices clear and added it to the Constitution, that we respect the right to privacy, and that this choice is between a family and their God, right, and their own family and community. And so these were moments where you realize that this isn't necessarily about what the voters want. There's a bigger national agenda that we are grappling with at the state level. And so my question again and again is, who are you representing and who is this bill for? And if you can answer that, then hopefully you'll vote the right way. We also beat back right to work, which is supporting unions in our state, and that one came up multiple times. Again, we've made our voices heard. We want to protect unions in the state. And so again, I shared this already, that we got some national attention. And the thing that I want to share, I can wrap it up with this, but the thing that I'm most drawn to in politics is courage. What I want to work with people who will stand up to potential opposition, to challenge, to friction, to being called names and in being intimidated, and say, I am voting for the people who voted for me. My constituents are my bosses. That's how I feel, and I'm drawn to anyone else who feels that way and who acts that way, because it's not easy. I mean, the amount of, speaking of social media and all of the other ways that people can get attacked and intimidated now, it is very, very intense. And this is standing up to this type of pressure is grueling. I mean, I watched my colleagues go through, and they're still going through incredible challenges. But if you come back to the why of who you work for your constituents, you work for the state of Montana, and we are independent, we care about our neighbors, and if we are paying attention and listening, we will vote in a way that supports continued growth and make sure that future generations can grow and thrive, can afford housing, can have health care, right, can have access to public lands. And then one last piece was just I was asked to also highlight women leading in the legislature. Very proud to work with. This is the hopefully future Senate Minority Leader Senator Laura Smith, and just women across the board coming in and advocating and giving testimony and talking about what it takes to take care of our communities. And so I think that there's a lot of relationship-driven governance, again, talking about those relationships and relational dynamics. We're a small state. We can still meet with and listen to and talk to each other. And so, yeah, that wraps it up, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cora. So as I listen to the four of you speak, there are a couple things that come to mind, and I'd like to throw these out here maybe before we open the floor to questions. Jon, you had mentioned specifically that northern tier and how important that was to Democratic voters or Democratic candidates previously in Montana. One of the things that really stands out to me in what Cora was saying, and this touches on the same region that you're talking about, Jon, is how important that north central Montana core is. And particularly in the Montana Senate, that was the core of the Republicans who you built a coalition with, right? I mean, that really was it. So I thought that was really curious. And then of course I think you can sort of pull that along the north, sort of when you get into like, you know, Denny Logie country, right, all the way over in the northwest. You sort of see it there. I think that's you know, maybe one of those things where we, you know, maybe the labels aren't quite as important as the demographics. And, you know, I say that thinking that, you know, these are people who are working together 50 years ago. They're still working together. That's still where you turn to, right? So I thought that was interesting. I do wonder, Riley, if you couldn't, I know this is kind of more Bob Brown territory, but I know you mentioned the road show. I'm curious if you couldn't talk a little bit about, you know, the influence on that same corridor in Montana in you know, drafting the Constitution in 1972, and what that looked at and the influence there. And you know, obviously that was a statewide thing. And I think if you know, I mean, I have to, you know, as a Bozeman kid, you know, I have to sort of acknowledge the two Dorothys, Dorothy Eck and Dorothy Bradley. Dorothy Eck, who was at the Constitutional Convention, participated, and I believe Dorothy Bradley, who was there but was not a delegate. So I'm wondering, Cora, if you could talk a little bit about that core, and then maybe Jon, if you could talk a little bit about sort of that, kind of what's in that part of Montana, what that spirit is, in the sense that that it is really still kind of an anchor for consensus.
We don't know who's supposed to go first, but now
yeah,
I'm talking, so here we go. I think I'll say maybe three quick things. First, I do think that the north central part of Montana had a lot to contribute in the Constitutional Convention. I think that it's worth one piece that I think is really worth pointing out. So we voted in 1970 by a 65% margin to have the Constitutional Convention. This comes out of that era that Bob Brown is experiencing. People are observing what's happening in Montana with our politics and our inability really to control what industry wants to get done with our political space. In 1972, when the Constitution was sent to the people of Montana, it passed by less than 51% of the vote. It was 50.5% that passed it, fewer than 3,000 votes. And I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind about that is that that had a huge amount to do with the relative decrease in power that was going to result from a decision by the constitutional delegates to draw our Senate maps based not on counties, but instead on population. This relates to that concept of one person, one vote that I had up on the screen, but it essentially is the idea that when you draw population-based districts, they have to be roughly equal, and our delegates decided to base our Senate on population-based districts instead of counties. In 1971, 16% of our population could control the outcome of votes in the Montana Senate. So we take that sort of context, and the delegates were also, another really important feature of the delegates is that they came from a lot of different backgrounds, but they were also mostly political newcomers because, and this is why Dorothy Bradley was not a delegate, is that she was a sitting legislator. And so you couldn't be, and we only had 2 women in the 1971 legislature out of 150. We elected 19 women to the 100-person delegation. And the folks who were elected, I suspect maybe had a lot of imposter syndrome because they were newbies and they came in reading a lot of material. They had packets of information to read. They elected, and I'll take it now to that sort of Great Falls and north part of the state. They elected Leo Graybill to be the chairman. I am sitting in for Rafe Graybill. If anyone saw some of the original, that's his grandfather. Leo Graybill was the chairman of the convention. He did not start out as wildly popular, but when he got there he actually came in last of the 8 delegates elected from Cascade County. But when he got there, he really put on a show. He made a lot of friends, and he became the chairman of the convention and did a pretty extraordinary job, I think, facilitating. The contingency of folks that are coming from that part of the state had a big say. I don't know if we can count Toole as quite north central, but Toole County had Delegate Vermillion. Not a lot known about Delegate Vermillion in the years after, not a lot online. But he was somebody who spoke a lot about the importance of including poll booth registration, that's election day registration, in the Constitution. We ended up with a may provide for poll booth registration instead of shall. He advocated for shall in large part because of where he came from in the state and because of the fact that it was so difficult oftentimes for people to make the trek to get registered to vote in advance of Election Day and to come back to vote on Election Day. And so this was sort of one of the things he advocated for. Lots of other exciting things, but I feel like maybe those are a few lovely tidbits, and I'll hand off to Cora.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is special, it's challenging to have a citizen legislature, because if you aren't retired or somehow independently wealthy, you have to work in between, which can be intense. But the beauty of the citizen legislature is that we do come home for a year and a half in between each session, and we are with our constituents. And one of the things that I noticed about the 9 that we worked with in the Senate was that they were from that north and northeastern and some western region, but the north is smaller communities that really are still talking with each other and engaging with each other. Some of the most hardline legislators in the Senate at this point come from Billings, come from Flathead, come from areas where you don't necessarily have to look your constituents in the eyes and in the face. And so I think there's that historical legacy, also in the agriculture world, of having Democrats really be allies, right, in agriculture, especially for the smaller to medium scale producers. And then also just that they're still talking to each other. They do have to go home and look at their constituents in the face, and I think that that's healthy. And I think that that's one of the big reasons that they do vote the way they do.
Yeah, I think Tom brought up the part about the High Line, Golden Triangle, to some extent Northwest Montana, the legislators that came from there and how they were voting in the last legislative session. I think there could be a whole another book written on that. I'm not going to do it. But it is an interesting thing. First, I think you have to look at the cities where when lines are being drawn every 10 years, go look at Bozeman, go look at Helena, go look at Billings, go look at Missoula. A lot of times they don't make a lot of sense. And that's because there's a nice way to draw lines that really create safe seats for one party. In the rural area, that's much harder to do. You're grabbing lots and lots of territory. You're grabbing whole counties. You're grabbing whole areas. And even though you're grabbing these vast swaths of land, oftentimes what's happening in these areas, in these rural areas, is there's people coming forward in their communities that are pretty well known. And so when they're running, people already kind of know, like, well, what career do they have? What business do they have? Where do they go to school? You know their kids, those kinds of things. And they're much more approachable versus in some of the urban areas, I think it's a lot harder sometimes to know exactly, well, who's my representative? Who's my senator? Wait, why is the line right here? And how does that divide us? That's not as true in some of these rural areas. And it's more significant when you consider in some of these areas when they can go up to the people that are running and saying, hey, there's this issue out here that's going to affect our education community, our schools. There's this bill out there that's going to impact our natural resource industry. There's a bill out there or an idea that's going to impact our hospital. What do you think about that? And people are going to know. So when the attack ads come, the mailers come, the robocalls come, and they start to, create a lot of sensation out of something about a community member that is very known, a lot of times those don't have quite the same impact that they would have in an urban area where you may not quite know who your representative or senator is. So I think it's still a cool part of Montana politics where these things are happening. I think we're seeing an unprecedented amount of money and sophistication normally reserved for regional and statewide races now going down into the primary elections, and it will be very interesting to see what kind of outcomes those produce, because as we know, it has real impact on a number of issues in our state legislature, and how we're governed.
Oh, go ahead.
Tag on to that. In terms of investments and just what I mentioned before about how much certain aspects of our politics are being really nationalized. Americans for Prosperity, I believe, is investing almost maybe close to $5 million from my estimation this year in primaries, and it just shows. And it's not coming. The money's not coming from inside Montana. So that sort of underscores the attempts that are being made to control how elected officials vote, as opposed to them voting for their constituents, voting for outside interests.
I'm curious, Zach, with your experience with the Kings and that community in Petroleum County, who do you think they look to for leaders? I mean, is leadership approached differently? I mean, and think about this, because you're a politician in an urban area. Do you think their approach to identifying candidates or somebody for representation is different than it would be in, say, Bozeman?
So as Cora said, you asked good questions, Tom, because this was something I didn't mention in my presentation that I wanted to. One of Winnett's superpowers that I've observed over my 15 years of being the president of their Bozeman area fan club is that that community is run by women. And when I was at my friend Jay's wedding, and I had that picture up there where I was standing with Brenda Brady and Laura Nolan, who are sisters, who are taking over their family's ranch and starting their own respective herds and doing family succession planning. I had a couple beers and I told them that, kind of an outsider saying, just an observation, do you think this is true? And they said, yeah, it's definitely true. And it's a beautiful thing because Chris King gets, I prop him up. He was a community leader, an elected official. We still live in a patriarchal society and world in many respects. But that community, all the folks doing all the work behind the scenes who are listened to and revered and respected are the wives and mothers. And you don't have to be there very long to really see that clearly. And I think the community sort of intuitively reveres and understands that, and it creates this, I think it really leads to that abundance dynamic that I talked about in my remarks. And I think I want to say one other thing, which is my friend Jay was in front of the legislature in 2021 arguing in favor of a bill that the Petroleum County Conservation District authored, reopening our nepotism laws to allow for related individuals to serve on and be appointed to different community boards and in elected offices. And it was the optics are funny, nepotism's bad. And Petroleum County was up there saying, we need nepotism. There's only 490 of us. Yeah. If you're fit to serve and this community respects you, we don't care if you're John's cousin or uncle. We need you to step up and serve our community on our school board or in the legislature or on the county commission or what have you. So those are two factors that really jump out to me about Petroleum County.
If it's okay, I might I would love to just draw a through line in some of the comments that we're making, because I think otherwise I'm going to sound like a Rolodex of constitutional facts, and that may not be all that helpful. I think one of the things that is really beautiful looking at the timeline that Jon presented, and then thinking specifically about what Zach is reflecting on in Gwinnett, and thinking also about the experiences that Cora has had in the legislature, and probably looking at our constitutional convention as a microcosm of larger sort of what it looks like when Montanans come together and do something. I appreciate that there is a change happening in our state in terms of the political makeup, and sort of that there's a concentration happening in some respects. I also think my experience has been moving around in the state of Montana. There are a lot of things that have not changed. People still value community to an extraordinary extent. We do select leaders based often on relationships. We are a small state with very long streets. And so the relative smallness of our population gives us, in some ways, an advantage, because we can actually genuinely know each other, and we're picking people to represent us that we genuinely know and are friendly with. And I also think that we value a lot of the same things. If we take the partisan labels out of the conversation, I think that we often find that we are in really good spaces, even if we disagree, that we can find ourselves communicating, coming to consensus. And Cora magnificently managed to do that even with partisan labels in the mix. And I guess I just want to sort of say that I don't know. I sort of push against the idea that we are deep red, or that we are purple, or that we are any of these. I love the schizophrenic politics, right? And I don't think that that's wrong. I think it's right. I think it speaks to the idiosyncratic nature of the ways in which we make decisions here in Montana that is largely community-based, community-led. And I actually think that's true even in many of our more urban areas. But I think it's especially true of our rural areas, and that we can and should be really proud that that is a significant part of how decisions are made in our state. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have about 8 minutes left, 10 minutes left. Open questions to the floor. If you have one, go ahead. Let me see if we can get you a microphone. Hold on.
Given the division that we've heard about today, the nasty nine in the Republican Party, whoops. I think it's your phone. Oh, maybe. And there's divisions too in the Democratic Party. Does that indicate that Montana is ready for a third party?
Do I want to answer that?
I can.
No, I understand. I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, Jon might have a historical perspective on this because I think, right now we're sort of, it's interesting. And Cora talked about national politics, and the thing that I was thinking about that entire time was, when change really sort of happens in Montana, it's when those national politics kind of merge with local politics, right? And so when those two things are on the same page, interesting things happen. But I do think that, and I thought Jon might be able to talk about the fact that we have had periods within the last 30 years where we had more parties on the ballot than we do now, right? Certainly, I'm thinking 2000, right? I mean, we had quite a few third parties, fourth and fifth parties. Isn't that the case?
And I am going to jump in just quickly
Yeah, go for
before,
it.
because I think it's a bridge. I did see a poll recently that I think it's 40% of Americans identify as
45.
independent.
45.
45 as independent, and we do have some independent candidates. So I'm wondering, yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm a terrible salesman when I mentioned my book and said, okay, I'm going to tell you how to get notification on it. I didn't. So if you go to bigskypolitics.com, you can enter your email there, and then as soon as it becomes available, you'll get an email. But we're talking about third parties, independents, minor parties, there's a section in my book that talks about that. By and large, I think their impact is overestimated in our statewide elections. I don't get to drill down into legislative elections quite as much. But oftentimes Republicans are like, well, we need the Green Party on the ballot because that's going to pull votes from the Democrats. And Democrats are like, we need a Libertarian on the ballot because that's going to pull from Republicans. There are a couple occasions where it seems interesting where maybe third parties on major statewide elections have had an impact, but it's very hard to quantify. But for the most part, I would say that we're electing people with majorities most of the time. And so, further on down the ballot, I would say we've had more consistently Libertarians, Green Party. There's some, for a time there was the Reform Party. That's another part of my book where I talk about Ross Perot's run, which is kind of the last time there was a really good effort at the national level to create a third option. And Montana actually, I think if I remember the statistic in my book, gave Ross Perot its second highest percentage out of all the states. And so at least Montana, at that snapshot in time in 1992, was very interested in that third option. The problem is with our system of government, winner take all of that is you can see a tiny bit of success maybe in an election or two, but eventually what happens is one of the parties adapts. One of the parties says, which is what happened with Republicans in 1994. They said, hey, Ross Perot's got some good stuff. We should adopt those talking points. Ushered in the Republican Revolution of 1994. So parties adapt, and that's what makes a third party, independent, any kind of that run, just kind of potentially just a temporary thing, at least in our history.
Well, thanks. If we could real quick, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want another question from the floor. Who has one? You, ma'am. Go ahead.
Just along those lines, what about getting rid of parties? Everybody's just who they are. How would that affect? Could that move us forward so that we don't have labels right out of the get-go and we automatically say, well, we don't like them or we don't like them?
This is kind of a bridge I wanted to jump in, and a feature of the 1972 Montana Constitution is a local government study commission process, and we're actually undertaking that process in Gallatin County right now. And one of the recommendations that the study commission has adopted and is moving towards is nonpartisan county elections. Yeah, I mean, the voters denied that actually not that long ago. So clap if you want, but I don't know. Count me as a skeptic that the voters will adopt it. We actually had a Montana State poli-sci professor who came out vehemently against it. He said partisan indicators were really important for issue identification with voters, and he won that debate, so to speak. But I think it's an interesting question. You can see how that theory of governance and electoral politics would really work beautifully at a community scale like Jon was describing, where there's a few hundred or maybe a few thousand people, but it's small enough that people can really know one another and know what each other's about and know what their history is and know where they generally stand on issues and how they move through the world and how they approach community problems. But at a much larger scale of tens of thousands of voters, I think that becomes really difficult. So as we urbanize, those labels, as frustrating and reducing as they are, I think are really important for helping people understand what this stranger running for elected office might be about and what values they might bring forward. All that being said, I would love nothing more than to be able to stand here as a 35-year-old and say I'm an independent. But I chose this label 12 years ago, and that horse has left the barn a long time ago. So here I am. You can all label me.
I'll just chime in and say I think that the most powerful change we could make is to get money out of politics. That is why I believe we can't get to know each other and who the candidates are, because there's so much money going into just BS. I mean, I remember knocking doors when I was running, and there were a lot of people who were not high educated on politics voters who couldn't tell the difference between Tester and Sheehy, because the attack ads both were saying so many horrible things that they were like, well, they sound like the same person to me. So that's a whole nother tangent, but I do think as important and powerful as getting rid of parties, because I do think they're problematic, if that was ever possible, is getting money out of politics.
And one more thought is after the 2016 presidential election, I read a fascinating book by Moeller, who's a political science professor at Princeton University. Moeller, like the German spelling, and it was called "What is Populism?" And he defines the resistance against toxic, corrosive, fear-based populism as being political parties and central committees and that organizational structure that distributes power away from individuals and kind of democratizes political structures and decision-making processes. So that's one argument in favor of party politics that I think is worth considering and wondering about. And it was just a really interesting book to read in this sort of era of MAGAism. So I throw that out there. What is populism?
Okay, if I could get in just one more question before we wrap up.
Just one quick insertion. Jeff McGee from the Bill Lane Center over here. I was, in 2000, I was working for the New York Times, and it was my job to do the election board for the states in Bush versus Gore election, not the Supreme Court case. That was the New York Times' first color printed election, so they'd never had colors before. Previously, networks had swapped every 4 years, red and blue for Democrat and Republican. So Reagan's '84 landslide was blue. Archie Say, the graphics director, said, well, Republican starts with R and so does red, so we'll make it that. And that's how it came to be. And that's why we're stuck with that.
I love that factoid. Thanks for sharing.
Okay, one more question. One more question.
Hi, everybody. Oh, does someone else have a microphone? Go ahead.
No, shoot.
Hi, thanks so much, you guys. Those is great comments from everybody. And I just was thinking about how rural-urban isn't the only kind of binary that we can divide ourselves by in Montana, nor do we choose to. And I just want to, I think the big one that was just barely touched on is tribal nations and other rural communities, but also between communities in Montana who are rural and are hoping for people to stay and for people to have a way of life there, and then communities that have experienced exponential amounts of growth, particularly from the recreation economy and real estate investment. And I guess I'd be curious to hear any comments on that. Cora, I am going to call you out because you're the representative for Big Sky, and there was some tax dollars that were diverted from the Madison County Hospital and from the schools back into Big Sky. And so just posing the question of what are the rights of the people who work in the recreational economy versus those who actually own property in it, I think comes to mind as a more specific question.
Yeah, happy to address that. And that's in my comment about how we continue to displace each other and have throughout history. That's another major challenge is money, right? Those who have money and resources and wealth versus those who don't, and how that is creating this really serious wealth gap in the state and particularly in Gallatin County. And the very imperfect workarounds and attempted solutions like the funding for the hospitals and the schools in Big Sky versus Madison versus Gallatin counties. So I could talk about it for a long time. What I would say is that I think that the conversation around the wealth gap is one that we need to have regularly and to go deep on, and maybe we will during this conference. But I think that listening to our constituents and hearing what it is that you need, and creative solutions that we come up with together it's a co-creative process for sure. And I do hope that, we did bring property tax relief to almost 400,000 Montanans. We did also pass a wealth tax. Not a wealth tax. A second home tax, and that is pulling an extraordinary amount of funding out of Big Sky for the rest of the state. So it's a messy process, but I appreciate you bringing it up.
And then, Tom, can I just touch on the Indian country comment? I think one observation I would share from my 15 years of closely observing Montana politics is in the last decade, roughly, some of Indian country has been to the right in some elections. I think particularly you could look at Crow country as an example of that. And it's mixed, and to reduce any of those results into a single narrative would be really oversimplifying a very complex situation. But what I would observe from the indigenous leaders that I worked with when I was in the legislature on both sides of the aisle is all of them, whether they were Republican or Democrat, were very focused on making government supportive of their communities. And so even the Republican indigenous leadership were very focused on things like Medicaid expansion or right to work and protections of middle class labor organizations, things like that. And so I think it's similar to what Jon and Tom were describing of that north central sort of Montana highline ethic of formerly Democratic, now Republican sort of centric leadership, centrist leadership. I think Indian country represents that as well in my experience in recent history, even if there are some shifts happening.
I think we have to wrap. Do we? Yeah. I'd love to do this for another half an hour, but I'm afraid our time is up. So thank you very much. And hopefully people will stick around if you have any questions.